It's Sunday night, and we're continuing our study on Revelation and on Daniel. The 70 weeks of Daniel is a very enlightening study. I've never heard any preacher preach more than one message and kind of lightly touch on the 70 weeks of Daniel. I did one series that was 18 months on Sunday morning, and the only reason I changed the message was because the people's brains were getting fried. It's like when I preached on the eyes, I used to preach on the eyes of the Lord, and Mary would say, "Are you going to preach on those eyes again tonight?" And that's a real complex study. I said, "Yeah, probably." She's going, "Oh, I don't know if I can handle it." After I see people just struggling with trying to understand, I'll usually move into something easier. But the 70 weeks is probably the most, I've got a book by Alvin McLean. Alvin McLean says, the 70 weeks of Daniel is the bridge from the Old Testament to the New. It bridges over like that. That's the 70 weeks of Daniel. And you've got any number of men. Now, I started teaching the 70 weeks of Daniel in 1964. That's a long time. 64, 74, 84, 94, 2004, 14, 53 years ago, I started teaching the 70 weeks of Daniel. I hadn't had it come together like it's come together in my mind now. I had a young Seventh-day Adventist here a while back say, "Do you know anything about the 70 weeks of Daniel?" And I said, "I know a little bit." And that's all I said to him. And then he wanted to argue with me, and I said, "Well, let me show you something. And I'll show it to you before we start. Look over here in Daniel." And I told him. He said, "Well, I think the 70 weeks of Daniel started with the third decree." I said, "There is nothing in the 7th chapter of Ezra that points to a decree about rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city. The 70 weeks of Daniel has to do with a decree to rebuild the city of Jerusalem." And I'm going to try to explain some things about that tonight. I'm going to try to slow down and say it slow so you can understand it. Now, over here in Daniel 9, 24 through 27, these are some of the most prolific words in all the Bible concerning prophecy. Because when the 70th week of Daniel comes, there are 6 things that are going to be brought out totally. 6 things. And that's what I took this fellow to. I took him to these 6 things. I said, "Here, let's open a Bible. Let's go over to the 70 weeks of Daniel." All through this chapter, Daniel has been reading about Jeremiah there in the 2nd verse of Daniel 9. He's been reading the book of Jeremiah. There's only 2 chapters he could have been reading. He could have been reading Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29. That's where 70 weeks are determined upon Israel. They had a sabbatical year. You have to understand the sabbatical year. I preached on it one night, and somebody said, that really explains the 70 weeks. They had a sabbatical year every 7 years. And that was so that the land would lie fallow. When you let something lie fallow, you leave it alone. You leave it alone so the nutrients will restore itself in the ground. You cannot plant a field every year. Eventually, it will not grow anything. I said it before, that's where those dust storms, which were the most devastating disaster that's happened in American history out there in Oklahoma. The dust storms finally spread all the way to Washington, D.C. from Oklahoma. And that was because the farmers that had grown things there, they knew nothing about crop rotating, about planting in rows and planting like so. They said you had to plant like that. If you don't know what to put into the ground to restore the nutrients or what kind of fertilizer you're to use. I said it before. If a farmer out there in the Midwest has 200 acres of ground, he can't plant them all every year. We call this crop rotation. He can plant certain ones one year, and depending on what some farm agent who's got his degree in agriculture or in husbandry of some kind, the word husband means the tiller of the soil. Husband is the word Georgios, Georgous. Georgios comes from gay, means soil or dirt, and ergon, meaning to till or to work the soil. Well, we get our name George from that. George means the tiller of the soil. Now, over here in the 9th chapter of Daniel, Daniel is really upset. You have to understand where Daniel is. Daniel is over here in Babylon. It is believed that Daniel was carried away along with Ezekiel from Israel, that they were carried away in the second deportation. Who's deporting Israel? Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is. Just call him Neb. And he goes over here and carries Israel off, and he's got 3 deportations, 1, 2, 3. The first deportation is approximately 605 BC. The second deportation is in the neighborhood of 597, 96 BC. What's he doing carrying Israel away? They're rebelling against the king of Babylon. He is their protector. And in that day and time, when you were under the rule of an empire, you had to pay them a tax. It was called a tribute. Remember when Jesus was here on the earth and the apostles come to him, said, is it right to pay tribute to Rome or not? And Jesus sent Peter out to catch a fish, and he caught a fish, and it had a silver in its mouth, and he said, now go pay the tax to Rome. You have to pay your taxes. People say, well, that's not the Constitution. Well, if the government says pay your taxes, pay them or go to jail. One. Don't listen to these people that say, we don't have to pay our taxes. There was a church that I used to go to up in Indiana. It was called Indianapolis Baptist Temple. That preacher did not withhold taxes for years. It was a huge church, about 5,000 on Sunday morning. And they got foreclosed on by the IRS, and they all lost their jobs. The building and everything was gone. Pay your taxes, Jesus said so. We don't care how it's against the Constitution. If they say do it, you do it, or you will go to jail, or you'll forfeit everything you got. And that's what that church did. And then these 2 deportations, because Israel was rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, these were peaceful deportations. You can find these over there in 2 Kings, right after Josiah. Josiah's in 2 Kings 22 and 23. And you can go into 24 and you can see these two deportations here, right here. Well, it's believed that Daniel and Ezekiel were carried away in this 597 deportation because those are peaceful. Israel gets so rebellious. Israel gets so rebellious. Ezekiel is having visions. He's in Babylon, about 650 miles from Israel. He's having visions about what God's going to do in Israel in 586 BC. That's when Nebuchadnezzar comes in with all of his chariots, literally annihilates Israel, annihilates their temple, cuts it to the ground, pulls all the big stones out that are in the walls, and the way they would destroy a city, they would burn down all the structures they could burn, pull down all the stones, and they would plow through it with a plow. I have all these guys with plows out there plowing through it, and then when they got through plowing it up, they would sow salt all through it so nothing would grow there. That was what was happening in Israel here. So the fact that they get over here in Babylon, why were they in Babylon? Because they went for 70 sets of these sabbatical years and never kept them. So 70 times 7 years would be 490 years. They never kept Sabbath, never kept their sabbatical years. You realize what would happen to ground in 490 years if you never let it rest? By their own actions, they brought famine upon themselves. God says, here's my program. He says, here's my program in Leviticus, the 25th chapter. He says, I want you every 7 years to leave the land alone. And then we'll have every 7 sets of these 7 years, every 49 years, the 50th year will be the year of Jubilee, and we will control greed in that year of Jubilee. You can read this in the 25th chapter of Leviticus. In that 50th year, everybody that owes anybody anything in Israel, it will be forgiven. And if you have accumulated a lot of land in Israel, you're a hustler, a real estate hustler, and you've bought land. Let's just say you're from the land of Benjamin, and you bought land down in Judah, you bought some land over in Gad, you bought some land over in Dan. Every 50th year, every bit of that land would go back to the original owners. Everybody would go back to square one. They'd go back to gold. They wouldn't collect $200, and everybody'd start from scratch. You think that's a good way to control greed? Well, Israel said, we're not going to do that. If you think we're going to take off every 7 years, first of all, it's not going to matter whether you think you're going to do it or not. You're going to burn the land up, planting it every year. Well, finally, God says, you won't behave yourself. You destroyed the land. I'm going to put you over here in Babylon for 70 years. And that's going to match up with all of those 70 years. In 70 years, God is saying, I can restore the land to its former richness. Restore land. What was God's promise in Deuteronomy 28? He says in Deuteronomy 28, if you're obedient to my statutes and my commandments and my laws, I'll fill up your storehouses. But I can't do that if you work the land. Even the 7th year, it's not ecologically possible. Israel ignored that. So whether God was going to send Nebuchadnezzar in or not, they still wasn't going to be able to grow crops there. They just literally sucked every bit of the nutrients out of the land in 490 years. Well, God says, besides the fact you've gone after other gods, you have oppressed the poor, You've gone after Baal and Grove and Shemash and Molech, which is the same thing as Christmas. I'm going to scatter you. I'm going to give you 70 years to repent when you're in Babylon. And I will fix the land so that it'll be nutritious one more time. So here's the way it looks. God says, I'm going to have all these prophets preach to you, and you're going to kill them and say, we don't like you telling us that we can't do these things. We got to keep these sabbatical years, and we can't go after these other gods, and we can't oppress the poor. They say, we don't like that. So God says, just for that, you got these 70 sets, 70 times 7. These sabbatical years you've never kept. That's 490 years. What I'm going to do, God says, I'm going to put you in Babylon for 70 years, one right after the other, so the land will be, the nutrients will be there. Had a fellow used to come here. He had a degree in biology. He said, you have to have so much snow to get enough nitrogen into the land in order for the crops to grow. And in the Midwest, the snow has stopped snowing. You have to have so much snow to have this. That shows that America has been planning, and that we have ignored God's laws, and I guess they've got these Farm Bureau agents out there that go out there and test the land, the environmentalists, and they'll test to see if they need to add certain fertilizers in there. And when they do that, they find out what they need to do. God says, if you come back after these 70 years, they were carried away in 586 BC. 586 BC. 70 years would be exactly 516 BC. That's the year they finished building the temple. And you got 3 decrees concerning the temple. And those decrees are given by the Persian kings. The Babylonian kings didn't give them any decrees. The Persian kings, and you'll find those decrees in the book of Ezra, and the last 4th decree will be in Nehemiah, and that will be concerning the rebuilding of the city, and that's where the 70 weeks of Daniel begins. What is the use of the 70 weeks of Daniel? It will take us to the end of time. So God says, did they come back in these 70 years? At the end of, no, a certain few came back. In fact, you can look over here in Ezra, the 2nd chapter. Ezra, the 2nd chapter. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms. Go back prior to Nehemiah. In the 2nd chapter, the first decree was given in the 1st chapter of Ezra. And that was concerning rebuilding the temple. And it was not. I got to show you something that people make a mistake on. And they say, well, the first decree was given by Cyrus. It won't even match up, not year-wise. In fact, 490 years, you add that, 490 years, and the first decree was given in 538 BC. So you have 894. You got 48 years before the birth of Jesus. They couldn't have been given in 538 BC. And you can put the figures on the 2nd decree. The 2nd decree, this one was given in the book of Ezra, 1st chapter, and also 2nd Chronicles, the 36th chapter. I'm just going to show you how many people came back in this in this second chapter, verse 64. The whole congregation together was 42,303. That's all that came back in the first decree, and there were millions of people over in Babylon. Why didn't they want to come back? Well, after they've been over there 70 years, in Babylon, let's see if I can find a Babylonian map. After they're over here for 70 years, the kings begin to release the Jews, allows them to buy land. One of the writers, I believe it's Mr. Edersheim, said there was a canal between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and all these rich Jews were living on that waterway, and here they are, wealthy, doing real good. Why would they want to go back down to Israel and rebuild a temple and start from scratch? And they didn't have any buildings. Everything was just rough over there, and there was no temple, there was no city, and Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it. Why do they want to go back when they're in Babylon doing fine? They don't want to go back. So only a few came back. Less than 50,000 came back in the first decree. And you had millions of people over here that were Jews. They were saying, we're just fine. We don't want to go back to a wasteland. You know, that's a lot like building the temple of God. It's like building the house of God. Christ is the son of his own house. Whose house are we? So, to build the house of God, which is what the temple was called, those first three decrees were about that. To build the house of God, the Bible says charity. In 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, charity edifieth. Edify is the word oiko, O-I-K-O-D-O-M-E-O, oikodomeo. It is a construction of oikos, meaning house or family, and dome, which is our word dome, or it's their word roof. And when they finished the roof of a house, they said the house was finished. Here's why men don't want to build the house of God. They don't want to love others and not themselves. They want to love themselves. Charity is the word agape, and agape is walking in the commandments of God. God says, build the house of God. People say, I don't want to build the house of God. I want to build me a new house. I want to buy me a new car, and I want to live for me. That's why I don't want to build up the house of God. That verse in 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, is the very image of the Old Testament. Building up the house of God was these 3 decrees. So God says, if you don't come back, and they didn't after the 70 years, he said, I'm going to measure out these 70 weeks to you. And at the end of the 70 weeks, Israel will all be back. And it's not just literal Israel, it is spiritual Israel will be built up, because in the New Testament, we are the spiritual Israel of God, building up this house of God. You got 3 decrees. The first one is given by Cyrus. Why am I saying Ezra? First one's given by Cyrus. The second one is given by Darius. And these are the kings of the Persian Mede Empire. There were more than these, but these are the important ones in the Bible. There were more than these. You had Cambyses here. You had Xerxes the the first and Xerxes the second. Artaxerxes the first and second. But the ones we are concerned with are Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. These were, Artaxerxes and Cyrus were Persian kings, and Darius was a Mede king. But they were peacefully reigning. They had some kind of an agreement that they would elect kings whenever they came in. And Artaxerxes gives the third decree. And there's this great argument among the so-called prophecy scholars about which decree started the 70 weeks of Daniel. There's no doubt it was the fourth one. Absolutely no doubt. The fourth decree was given by Artaxerxes. Fourth decree. These decrees have to do with Israel is in Babylon. Has to do with them going back home. The first three decrees have to do with the temple. Read the first two. This one by Cyrus and this one by Darius have to do with building the temple. Building. But Darius could not give a decree to rebuild the temple. He could only give a decree to reinforce this one over here. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say it several times during the lesson. The decrees of the Persian Mede Empire were unalterable. They could not be changed, not even by the king himself who made the decree. Cyrus, once he gave a decree, could not change it as long as the empire stood. Darius couldn't change it. That's why once Cyrus gave the decree, all Darius could do would be give a decree to reinforce this first decree. He couldn't give it again. Once it's given, it's law from then on. And neither could Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes gives the third decree concerning supplying the temple. The temple that had been built and finished in 516. 516. Remember, 70 years in Babylon. They were carried away in 586 BC. 70 years later would be 516. This decree, the first one, is given. It shows it's given twice, but it's not given twice. It gives two accounts of the decree. Let me show you these accounts. Go back to Second Chronicles. I'm going to go through this slow. If I have to say it again, you're getting a teaching on the 70 weeks of Daniel you won't get in any church in America. There ain't nobody across America is teaching on the 70 weeks of Daniel tonight. Nobody. I know that because you have to understand Israel's history, how they went after Baal in the grove and oppressed the poor and never kept their sabbatical years. You have to understand that before you can even teach this over here. That's why they were scattered. That's why their temple was destroyed. That's why Nehemiah was so sad when he heard the word in the first chapter of Nehemiah. Nehemiah and Ezra must have been contemporaries. They lived at the same time. They were friends. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. That's the way the books are written down. So Nehemiah was a real close friend of Artaxerxes. Daniel was a real close friend of Darius, and Daniel was friends with these Persian kings. They look like Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes look like, to a degree, believers. I don't know if they were or not. I do believe Nebuchadnezzar was a believer, because when God struck him down in the 4th chapter of Daniel and put him on his all fours, God says, Nebuchadnezzar looked out over Babylon. It was this magnificent edifice sitting in the middle of a desert straddling a river. He said, is this not great Babylon that I have built? God struck him down, put him on his all fours, and made him eat grass with the cattle of the field, till you know, he said, that God gives the kingdoms of this world to whomsoever he will, and he places over it the basest of men. Shafal is the word basest. It means the most low-down men. He said, until you know that, when Nebuchadnezzar stood up after 7 times, I believe it was 7 months, till his nails grew out like bird claws, till his hair grew out like bird feathers. That was probably 7 months. He couldn't go 7 years eating grass. He wouldn't last that long. But he ate grass with the cattle of the field for 7 times. And Nebuchadnezzar stood up on his feet. And these are the words of Nebuchadnezzar. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He doeth according to his will among the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay God's hand or say to him, what doest thou? The word stay means, so this is Nebuchadnezzar saying, no one can arrest the hand of God when he goes to do something. I believe we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. Won't see Belshazzar. He was a wicked, evil, godless, lascivious man. Now here in the 36th chapter of 2 Chronicles is 2 Chronicles 36 is the destruction of Judah, which is southern Israel, the southern 2 tribes, which would be Judah and Benjamin. It's the destruction of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. And here's the way it puts it. This is, you got the destruction of northern Israel in the 17th chapter of 2 Kings. You got this destruction of southern Judah in 2 Chronicles 36 and in 2 Kings 25. So if you're going to read this, read the 25th chapter. This is 2 different accounts of Israel's destruction. You want to read both of the chapters. Both of them will show you how Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He calls for Zedekiah, the wicked king of southern Judah, and he says, bring him his sons before me. And he killed his 2 sons before his very eyes, and then he had his eyes punched out, put him in bonds, and carried him away to Babylon naked. And Zedekiah is never heard from again. What a way to go. It was Zedekiah that hung Jeremiah in the mire. That's that picture on the back wall there. And Zedekiah was a pansy, just a sissy king. I couldn't stand the guy. I don't think I'll see him in heaven, or I would tell him, you were a real jerk if I did. Now, let's read this. This is the first decree. Let's read a little bit of it. God says he sends his messengers, and his messengers were his prophets. And here's what they did to them in Israel when the prophets would come and preach to them. Who were the prophets? Well, you had Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. You had Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. That's all the minor prophets. And had the major prophets come to them, they would make fun of them, they would kill them, they would destroy them. And look here what it says they did. But they mocked the messengers of God in verse 16 and despised God's words. They said to Ezekiel, we'll come and listen to you talk, but we will not do what you say in that 33rd chapter of Ezekiel. They said to Jeremiah, we will worship the Queen of Heaven if we want to. Don't tell us not to worship her. That's our business. And misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, Israel, till there was no remedy, no marpe, M-A-R-P-E, no cure, till there was no cure. Sounds like distress of nations with perplexity, doesn't it? Aporia, no answer, no way out. And Luke 21 and 25 sounds the same thing. It's the same basic word, except one's in the Greek, the other's in the Hebrew. Till there was no cure. Therefore he brought up upon them the king of the Chaldees. That is Nebuchadnezzar. Chaldee was another term for Babylon, which slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. Who's going to be in the house of the sanctuary? The priests of God. Nebuchadnezzar came in and slaughtered Israel while they were priests in the house of God. They were worshiping Baal in the grove, and they were supposed to be worshiping Jehovah God. And had no compassion on young man or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into the hand of these young soldiers, and they slaughtered them. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. The night that Babylon is brought down, Belshazzar is sitting on the throne in Babylon, partying with the vessels of the house of the Lord. What are these vessels? Well, the cups and the snuffers and the things they needed to serve God with in the temple. He was partying with those vessels that were carried away here by Nebuchadnezzar. And they burnt the house of God and break down the wall of Jerusalem. They literally Nebuchadnezzar made Jerusalem look like a wasteland before he was through. And Israel deserved everything they got from him. And burnt all the places thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. Now this will remind you of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is walking through the streets of Jerusalem, telling Israel to repent, and telling the people in Jerusalem, do not go to Babylon for protection. Not Babylon. Do not go to Egypt for protection. If this is Israel here, and Babylon is on the Euphrates over here, here's the Persian Gulf. He said, when Nebuchadnezzar comes this way, do not run to Egypt. Because if you do, Jeremiah said, he tells you all through the book of Jeremiah, over there in the 26th, 27th, 28th chapter of Jeremiah, he says, if you run to Babylon for protection, God will have one of these, God will cause a Babylonian soldier to chase you down. He may not even know what he's doing or how he's doing it, and he will kill you. I'll make sure that comes to his mind. You have to go to Babylon for 70 years so I can restore the nutrients to the land. Then I'll call you back. You go over here, you have no hope with the king, with Pharaoh Necho. He was the Pharaoh at that time. Necho can't save you from the king of Babylon. Don't go to Egypt. That's what Jeremiah kept telling them. And they had all kinds of false prophets coming along and saying, Jeremiah don't know what he's talking about. In verse 20, them that escaped from the sword carried away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the king of Persia. Now, up until this verse, when they're carried away, is 586 BC. That's Babylonian conquering Israel. And the Persian kings come in 539 BC and overthrow Babylon. And then these kings come along and start giving these decrees, and immediately you jump 86, 76, 66, 56, 46. You jump over 40 years down to 539 as you move from verse 20 to verse 21. You jump a little over 40 years. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. Got to stay in Babylon for 70 years until the land restores its nutrients. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. A score is 20, 70 is 60, plus 10 is 70. You got to stay in Babylon 70 years, and if you don't come back, all of you, I'll measure out the 70 weeks, starting with the rebuilding with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in verse 22, we've jumped away from Babylon, carrying Israel away in verse 20. We jumped up over 40 years with the king of Persia. The first king that comes in is Cyrus. Verse 22, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing, and that's very important, saying, anytime a Persian king made a proclamation, put it in writing, it could never be withdrawn, not even by the king himself. Where do you get that, Jim? Look at Daniel, the 6th chapter. That has to go with this. Daniel 6. Daniel 6. This is about Daniel having some enemies in Babylon. Daniel finds favor with every king that comes along. Daniel is he's a lot like Joseph. You remember Joseph was very good looking, a goodly man, and even his brothers saw that he was favored. He was favored like Joseph. He was well favored. Daniel was well favored. The kings liked Daniel. He was a gentle, kind, understanding man. Very gentle to deal with. And over here in Daniel, where was I going?
Daniel 6.
Huh? Daniel 6, yeah. Daniel 6. Daniel had a lot of enemies in Persia. When the Persians Persia was the same thing as Iran today. Iran, Afghanistan, all the stands all were in Persia. Well, the Persian kings stayed in Babylon. They made their headquarters in Babylon. They all liked Babylon. It was beautiful. So in chapter 6, Daniel is still in Babylon. He was taken captive by the Babylonian kings, but it's the Persians that's ruling now. In verse 1, it pleased Darius, which he was a Mede king of the Persian Empire. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first. Daniel is top man in the kingdom other than Darius himself. Boy, those guys were always making grade fast when they were righteous men. That the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then said Daniel, Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and above all the princes. He's very popular with Darius. Darius loves Daniel because an excellent spirit was in him. He's a lot like David was when Saul heard the women singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s, and Saul got jealous of David. But he saw there was a good spirit in David, and he tried to have David killed, but he failed. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel because he was number one in the king's eyes. Envy will destroy. And they were so envious of Daniel, they said, we got to find a way to kill him. But Darius loves him. But they have decrees. If we can get Darius to make a decree and get Daniel to cross that decree. They knew Daniel. They knew Daniel sat in front of his window every day and prayed to the Lord God daily. They knew that. They sought occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in Daniel. He was as good as a man could be. He was just like David at one point. He was just like Joseph. They couldn't find fault in him, so they had to make up lies about him. Then said these men to Darius, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The only way we can find something against him. Then these presidents, princes, assembled together. Remember, he's the head man among the presidents and the princes. He holds more sway with Darius than all of them put together. To the king, and said unto him, King Darius, live forever. Boy, that's the thing to do. Let's go polish up Darius. Let's go tell him how wonderful he is. And then we'll sneak in Daniel transgressing the law of King Darius. But Darius loved Daniel. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whomsoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save from King Darius, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast in the den of lions. And you know what happens to Darius? He's got all of this butter dripping all over him. Boy, they have slicked him up and buttered him up to no end. And he said, you're right, I'm a great and wonderful king. That's what the charismatics do. Brother, God has a blessing for you. They put their hand on your shoulder. If one of them does that to me, I'll say, get your hand off my shoulder. God's got a blessing for you, and he's going to do great things with you. They want to get in your pocket. That's what they wanted. Whoever says, ask any petition of any god for 30 days, since you're such a wonderful king, they have to come through you first. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. You cannot change the decree of the law of the Medes and Persians. And you can't change it, O great king. And Darius loved Daniel. They've tricked him with boasting on him, with buttering him up, with putting the con on him. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and decree, and once they put something in writing, it is permanent from then on. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times in a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Then all of these presidents and royal men of Babylon, of Persia, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God before the 30 days was up. fact, the same day. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. You said, king, you wrote it in writing. Remember what you did? Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? We'll get rid of our enemy here. They didn't realize that God was on Daniel's side. The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which alters not. It doesn't change. No one can change it, not even me. The king is angry at himself, for one thing, for being a sucker and being suckered by all this bragging and boasting on him. Watch out. Woe unto you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. Do you know most of us can be swayed by good words and fair speeches? When somebody sounds too good to be true, they are every time. I never trust. I have a hard time trusting people that are happy all the time. Somebody's liked by everybody. I had a guy in my house the other day. His wife said, everybody likes you. I said, and I looked at him and said, that's your trouble. That's your problem. That if you're friends with the world, you're an enemy of God. You can't be everybody's friend. He dropped his head and said, you're right. God's dealing with his heart. I know he is. You can't be everybody's friend because you can't stand for truth when you do. Now, Daniel could have pulled a shade or not prayed there in front of the window, but he did that every day. He wasn't going to change. He's going to trust God. So the law and the Medes and Persians don't alter. When Cyrus gives that first decree, it's done. No one can give that decree again. It's kind of like they got a decree out here in Hendersonville. You can only go 45 down Gallatin Road. It don't have to be passed every time somebody speeds. It's done. You get in a 70-mile speed limit zone up here the other side of Gallatin. They don't have to pass that every time somebody speeds. It's done once and for all until a new administration comes in and changes the laws. The Medes and the Persians said, we have laws that you cannot alter, and that is a part of our system. You can't change it. The king himself can't change it once he gives it. And Darius knew that. Then answered they and said before the king in verse 13, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, you see, he went over in captivity around 597. Regardeth not thee, O king. He doesn't care anything about your decrees. Thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day to his God. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. Not with Daniel. He was mad at himself for being suckered in by these crooks, which were presidents of the kingdom. But Daniel was the top president. He was mad at himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him because he loved Daniel. But he couldn't. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver Daniel. What have I done to my dear friend Daniel? He has to put him in with the lions. Has no choice. Anytime you find, it's like in the book of Esther, when Haman, the enemy of God over in Babylon, during the Persian under Xerxes, or Ahasuerus as he's called in the Bible, he goes to the king of Babylon, Xerxes, and says, make a decree that we can kill all the Jews. They're trying to overthrow you here in Babylon. And he suckers the king in, and gets him to make a decree which doesn't alter the same thing in Esther. And he can't change it once he says, okay, you can kill all these Jews out here. The only problem is Mordecai, which is the uncle of Esther, and Esther is one of the favored wives of the king, and Mordecai comes to Esther and says, tell your husband, King Xerxes, that this Haman has tried to undermine all of Israel. And Haman didn't understand that Esther was a Jew, and so was her uncle Mordecai. So she goes to the king, says, I know you can't change this decree. Can you give the Jews a decree, since they outnumber all of Haman's army? Can you give them a decree that they can defend themselves when he comes to kill them all? He says, sure, and he writes it out, and justice is going to be done. And before it's over with, the Jews overthrow Haman and all of his horde, and Haman is hung on a tree. And when they hang a man on a tree, they run it up his rectum and out his mouth. Haman said, I'm having a hard time talking here. I got this tree in my mouth. I think that's funny. See, they can give more decrees. So let's see what happens to Daniel here. We kind of know the story, but it's a picture of the decrees not altering. King Darius would have let him out if he could have. It was against the law for him to do that. In verse 15, then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. It can't be changed. You said it, you do it. Put him in the lion's den. Then the king commanded that they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, the king is, this makes me wonder if King Darius wasn't a believer. Darius says, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver you. Thank God for that. Thank God for Darius. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and it was against the law to break that signet. You could be put in the lion's den if you break that seal. And with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might be changed concerning Daniel, might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. He was upset, afraid he's going to lose his dear friend Daniel. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and he couldn't sleep because of Daniel's situation. But he said, Your God will deliver you, Daniel. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. I'm well. God made these lions go to sleep, and I used one of them for a pillar. Thank you, king. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, you're innocent, have I done no hurt. This wasn't Daniel's doing, and it wasn't Darius' doing. It was those evil, godless men that were envious of Daniel. Beware of envy. It'll get you in trouble every time, and God will destroy you with it. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel. And he's going to make another decree. He says, all right, now let's make another decree. You go into the lion's den. And they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives. And the lions had mastery over them and break all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. And the lions killed all of them. There were a lot of princes in Israel that died that night. Then King Darius wrote unto all the people and nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Whew. He says, this is the God we're going to serve here. For he is the living God. He must have been a believer, didn't he? And he is the living God, and steadfast forever in his kingdom. That which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth. He worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth. Who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, let's go back over here and see how this applies to the decrees. Look here go back over here to Ezra, the first chapter. Now, we see in 2 Chronicles, the 36th chapter, that he makes a decree. Let's read it one more time, verses 22 and 23 in 2 Chronicles, 36th chapter. Verse 22, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, in that Jeremiah, the 29th and the 25th chapters, by the mouth of Jeremiah. Is there a horn beeping?
Yeah, I'm checking. It's an alarm.
Is that my horn? I'll see if it is. I punched something, it may have been mine. Now the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that was in 539 to 538 BC, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing. He is the Persian king, and it will not be altered, and it can't be repeated. Once it's law, it's permanently law. Thus saith Cyrus king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem. That's not the city. That's not the beginning of the 70 weeks of Daniel. The 70 weeks of Daniel will begin, Daniel 9:24 through 27. It will begin with a decree to restore and build Jerusalem, the city. It will not have to do with the temple. Which is in Judah, who is among you of all the people, the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up to rebuild the temple. That's the decree in writing. Can't be changed. Can't be added to. It's a law. Flip the page and you're in Ezra. Ezra, the first chapter, the next page, just flip it over. Unless you got a Bible with Ezra on the same page. In Ezra, the first chapter, verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, 539 to 538 BC, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation to all the kingdom. He's not making it twice. Ezra is simply repeating what the last chapter, 36th chapter of 2 Chronicles is about. Just repeating it. And he made a proclamation to all his kingdom and put it in writing, saying, if a Persian king puts something in writing, it's law from then on. And he don't need another decree to rebuild the temple. And there won't be another one to rebuild the temple. Thus saith Cyrus king of Persia, The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He overthrew Babylon. He was the Lord and master of all the civilized world at this point. And he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So this is like two witnesses. It's spoken of in the 36th chapter and the first chapter of Ezra. Now, that's the first decree given by Cyrus in 538 BC. The second decree becomes by Darius, and Darius knows all about the law, and the law of the Medes and Persians are not alterable. Even he can't alter them. So, when you go over here to the 6th chapter of Ezra, they start building the temple. And they get some flack. They catch in this book of Ezra, here's what happens. There's a man who is governor of what they call the Transjordan region. Transjordan means beyond the Jordan River. And the man who is the governor is a man named Tatnai. And he raises up objection to Israel rebuilding this temple. And the first decree is given 538 BC. And the second decree is in 520 BC. And that is by Darius. Why do they need another decree? Because they get so much flack in 536 BC that they stop building the temple. They stop the temple building. And there for 16 years until 520. Now they've only got till 516 to finish the temple, because they're carried away captive in 586 BC. Then they're overthrown by the Persians, 538. The first decree is given in 539. They're overthrown, And the first decree is given in 538 by Cyrus in the book of Ezra, the first chapter, Ezra 1, and in 2nd Chronicles 36. That the decree to rebuild the temple. The second decree comes in 520. That is in Ezra. Ezra, the 6th chapter. The decree is because Tatnai has raised up objections and gone to Israel and said, you are a rebellious city. It's known throughout the world that you rebelled against God, your God, and you rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon at that time. You're rebellious. It scared the people. They stopped building. Let's stop. And God sends two prophets. They come in 520. He sends two men. He sends Haggai. The book of Haggai and the book of Zechariah can go into this section here. Haggai prophesies for 3 years. When you read Haggai, he's talking about you dwell in your sealed houses. You got ceilings on your houses. You got everything going on for you. And the house of God is lying waste. Get off your tail ends and get back busy building the house of God. That's what the book of Haggai is about. In fact, if you'll turn over there real quick. In fact, in the 5th chapter, before we go over there, to Haggai. Look here in the 5th chapter of Ezra. Ezra, the 5th chapter. Then the prophets Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied unto Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Now, look at verse 3. I'll read verse 2. Let me read verse 2. Then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak, and began to build the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. With them were the prophets of God helping them. Haggai and Zechariah is helping the people. Who is this Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel. He is an ancestor of Christ. Zerubbabel is a descendant of Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah. If they were allowed to have kings, he would have been king. And this Jeshua is a descendant of Aaron the high priest. He would have been high priest at that time. He was the priest. So these two men are on the scene. And Zerubbabel, when you look in Matthew, the 1st chapter, it gives you the lineage of Christ. And Zerubbabel is one of the ancestors in Christ's lineage. If they'd had allowed to have kings, this would have been the king, and this would have been the high priest. And then comes the opposition in verse 3. And at the same time came to them Tatnai, governor on this side of the river. On this side of the river of Jordan, here's Babylon over here. On this side of the river, Tatnai is the governor. And he thinks he has the right to tell Israel what to do. When there's a decree that comes from the king himself to rebuild the temple, and he tells them, you stop doing that. He can't do that. What he's doing is treasonous. And at the same time came to them Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, and Shetharboznai and their companions, and said unto these people of Israel, who hath commanded you to build this house of God, this temple? Who told you you could do this? And make up this wall? Then said we unto them after this manner, what are the names of the men that make this building? And the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease, till the matter come to Darius, who is now the king of Persia. Darius is about 650 miles away in Babylon. He's the king of the Persian Empire. And then they returned answer by letter concerning this matter. The copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, and Shetharboznai and his companions, the Apharsachites, which were on this side of the river, sent unto Darius the king. They sent a letter to Darius. They didn't matter to find out that there was a decree given and that it was King Cyrus that gave him the decree to build it. And it was against the law to defy that law. What Tatnai and his buddies are doing, they're defying the law of the Medes and the Persians. They're trying to change it. They sent a letter unto him. Therein was written thus unto Darius the king, all peace. Be it known unto the king, Darius. They're sending this letter from Israel, where Tatnai is governor, 600 and so miles away, over to Darius over in Babylon. It's going to take months for it to get there. Probably sent by camel and then by donkey and whatever they have to do. Now, the copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, and Shetharboznai and his companions, the Apharsachites, which were on this side of the river, sent unto Darius the king. They sent a letter unto Darius, wherein was written thus, Unto Darius the king all peace, be it known unto the king Darius, that we went unto the province of Judea, to the house of the great God, which is built with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls, and this work goeth fast on and prosperous in their hands. What do you think of that, Darius? There's a lot of bad blood going on here, isn't there? I'm sorry, this decree has come from Cyrus, and it can't be changed. And what Tatnai is doing is defying the law of the Medes and the Persians. Then asked we these elders, and said unto them, Thus, who commanded you to build this wall and make up these walls? We ask their names also to certify thee, that we might write the names of the men that were the chief among these Jews over here. They're not the ones that made the decree. It was Cyrus. Boy, they're treading dangerous ground. For thus they returned us answers, saying, We're the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and build the house, or build the temple of God, that was builded these many years ago by Solomon, over there in 1 Kings. He got his decrees to rebuild this. He finished it up in 1 Kings, the 9th chapter. He started building it in 1 Kings, the 3rd chapter. And builded these many years ago, which a great king of Israel builded and set up. That was Solomon they were referring to. But after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldeans. That's just reviewing 36th chapter of 2nd Chronicles. Gave him over to the king of Babylon, who destroyed this house and carried the people away to Babylon, reminding us what happened. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same king Cyrus made a decree that was unalterable, and you guys are trying to alter it, to build a house of God. And the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, and brought them into the temple of Babylon, these did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name is Sheshbazzar, which is another term for Zerubbabel, put into the hands of who would be king, whom he had made governor. And he said unto him, Take these vessels, go, carry them unto the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be builded in this place. And that was a law of the Medes and Persians. And no one can change, and not even you, Tatnai. Then came the same Sheshbazzar and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Sheshbazzar was a Babylonian name for Zerubbabel. And he was in the king's lineage. He was a descendant of Judah, and the kings come out of Judah. And since that time, even until now, hath it been in building, and it's not even finished yet. Now therefore, if it seem good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house, which is there at Babylon, whether it be so, to see if Cyrus gave this decree. The king at this point is Darius. He cannot make a decree to rebuild the temple. He can only reinforce the decree that is already there. You couldn't give it twice. It's a permanent decree. That a decree was made of Cyrus the king to build the house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. Now tell us what to do, O great King Darius. So, in the 6th chapter, Darius gives a decree, but it's not to rebuild the temple. First of all, he says, we got to find out if this original decree was made. So he starts searching for the original decree. It's funny what happens. Then Darius king made a decree, and search was made in the house of the rolls. That's where they kept all of their rolled up scrolls, like a stack of books, where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. And there was found at Achmetha, which is in the palace, that is in the province of the Medes, a roll, and therein was a record thus written: in the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. All that Darius can do is make a decree concerning the first decree. He cannot change it. He can't even make a decree saying rebuild the temple. He can only make a decree reinforcing the first decree. He found it in the summer house of Cyrus. So he's going to make a decree that's going to make Tatnai look like a cat on a hot tin roof going, whoa! That's what Darius does. I think the decree he makes is hilarious. How much time do I have, Mike? 13. Let's read this. Let the house be builded. This is Cyrus' decree. It's just repeating Cyrus' decree. Let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, let the foundations there be strongly laid. This is not Darius' decree. This is repeating Cyrus' decree, because you can't remake the decree that's already given. It can't be done. The height thereof 60 cubits, the breadth thereof 60 cubits, with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber, and let the expenses be given out of the king's house. Tatnai, you're the governor, you're the civil governor over there. I want you to pay for this. Boy, he must be beside himself. And also let the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem, and brought them to Babylon, be restored to the Jews in that temple over there. And brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, everyone to his place, everyone to his place, and placed them in the house of God. Now therefore, Tatnai, I got something to say to you. Tatnai didn't know he was getting into this kind of a jam with the Persian Empire. He is treasonous what he's doing. Now therefore, Tatnai, governor beyond the river Shethar-Bozenai, and your companions, the Apharsachites, which are beyond the river, let the work of this house of God alone. Do you hear me, Tatnai? This was the decree given by Cyrus, and you shut your mouth. You understand me? That's what Darius is saying to him. Leave it alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. You got me, Buster. Boy, I don't believe Darius is being gentle about this. Moreover, I make a decree. Here's my decree. This is the second decree to reinforce the first decree. Here's my decree. What ye shall do to the elders of these Jews for the building of the house of God, that of the king's goods. You're handling the king's tribute over there in Israel. Tatnai, pay attention to me. You're supposed to be in charge over there of the king's business over there. Concerning the king's goods, even of the tribute beyond the river, tribute was paid to Persia for the privilege of living in their empire. Now, I'm going to tell you what to do, Tatnai. Forthwith, expenses be given unto these men, that they be not hindered. Whatever they need, Tatnai, now you didn't expect this. If they need money to finish this, you give it to them. Do you understand me? If you don't do this, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to you. And that which they have need of, both young bullocks and rams and lambs, to offer their sacrifices for burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, oil, according to the appointment of the priests which are at Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail. Do you hear me, Tatnai? that they may offer sacrifices of sweet savors unto the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also I have made a decree that whosoever shall alter this word, which includes you, Mr. Tatnai, let timber be pulled down from his house, being set up, let him be hanged thereon, and let this house be made a dunghill for this. You'll be hung up on a tree, as I said before. Now, Tatnai, you know how we hang people. We run a big timber up his bottom and out his mouth. This is what will be done to you if you don't do what I tell you. You got that? And Tatnai's going, whoo, all right, let me get to it. I think this is hilarious. Look at Tatnai. And the God that hath caused his name to dwell there, destroy all kings and people that shall put to their hand to the altar, and destroy this house of God which is at Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done quickly with great speed. Do you understand me now? That was the second decree. It wasn't to rebuild the house. It was to reaffirm the first decree, because you can't remake a law that's already been made. Then Tatnai, governor on this side of the river, Shethar-bozenai and their companions, according to that which Darius the king had sent. So they did speedily. They come over here complaining and griping about Israel rebuilding the temple. That's the same thing we are confronted with. When charity edifieth, agape, walk in the commandments of God, builds up the house of God. When we walk in God's commandments and we go out in public, agape is walking the commandments of God. This is agape, this is love, that we walk after his commandments. When we walk after the commandments of God, building up the house of God, and agape edifies or builds the house, oikodomeo, building the house of God. That's what it does. And people don't like us out here building up the house of God, do they? And we have a Tatnai in our life. It may be your boss, it may be somebody at the store, but they don't like you building the house of God and getting out here and witnessing and testifying, building God's house, which house you are. God, Christ is the son of his own house. Whose house are we? We have to build the house of God, which is in us. Let's read Mr. Tatnai, see what he's going to do. Then Tatnai, governor of this side of the river, and his companions, according to which Darius the king had sent, so did they speedily. And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. They finished the house of God. And it goes on. And look over here at the book of Haggai. Haggai, his job was to tell Israel to get back busy. You've been laying down for 16 years. You stopped because of this man Tatnai. He has no authority over you. Not when the king himself gives you a commandment to rebuild it. Look here in Haggai. Now you can read Haggai and understand what he's talking about, can't you? Look here in Haggai. If you'll notice, he's talking about building the house of God. That's amazing. And the charismatics will get a hold of this and say, they'll twist it into making something for themselves. In the 2nd year of Darius ascended to the throne in Persia in 522 BC. 522. So this is in 520. This is in 520 when Haggai starts prophesying. In the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, which was one of the lineage of Judah, and the scepter will not depart from Judah. And he's an ancestor of Christ in the first chapter of Matthew. The son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah. He's governor because they didn't let him have kings. And to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house shall be built. They stopped building in 536. That's what he's saying. You're saying the house wouldn't be built now, but that's not true. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye that dwell in your sealed houses? What about God's house? You're sitting over there lazy, sitting down for 16 years. And this house is lying waste. Get off your bottoms and get back building. That's what Haggai's job was, to tell them to stop this sitting around. Now, therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways, Israel. You're laying down on the job. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. Remember, he said, if you're obedient to my word, I'll fill up your house, I'll fill up your store, I'll fill up everything. You'll have plenty of crops. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there is none warm, because you're not obeying God. You stopped on him. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag full of holes. Reminds me of the old Hank Williams song, My Bucket's Got a Hole in It. He said, you're putting it in the bag that's full of holes, and it's going to be full of holes until you're obedient to God. Let me tell you, that applies to us. Your life will not smooth out. I'm not saying you're not supposed to have problems, but your life won't get right until you're committed to him and obey him in everything. Just to understand and accept that he works all things after the counsel of his own will, and everything give thanks. This is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you, and that means all the bad things that happen in your life. Give thanks and keep building the house of God. You understand what I'm saying when I'm talking about build the house of God? We're the house of God, and charity is what builds up the house of God. Charity is agape. That's one of the words that's been translated to love. It don't mean to like. It's walking in the commandments of God. 2 John 6, when you walk in God's commandments, you'll agonize over sin, agonizomai, strive. It's the word strive, to enter into the straight gate. You'll humble under the hand of God. These are imperative commands. God's commandments are more than just the 10 commandments. It's every imperative mood in the Greek text. And when we do this, God will bring contentment to our lives. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build God's house, and I will take pleasure in it when you build up this house, and will be glorified, saith the Lord. You looked for much, and lo, it came to little. I told you that you wouldn't. You'll go out there in the field and you'll reap, and there won't be much, because you are not obedient to the word of God. To build God's house, you got to be obeying him. Y'all realize I could stop and go into building the house of God and spend months on that? I'm out of time. I hope you can understand this is about us building God's house, whose house are we? By walking in God's commandments. It matters not the opposition that we get. We've all got a Tatnai in our life, don't we? That wants to stop us from doing what we do. Well, I've run out of time. These first two decrees have shown you some things about our lives and how we need to live. I would like to keep talking, but I've run out of time. At least you know what Haggai is about and what Zechariah is about. They were sent. Haggai preached for 3 months, and Zechariah preached for somewhere around between 2 and 3 years. And they're talking about rebuilding God's house. They were sent for that specific purpose. Boy, what a calling to build up this house. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for truth. Lord, help us to understand the Old Testament is our shadow, and the very image is us. We are the house. Teach us to walk in all your commandments. We'll praise you for all things. God, we pray for strength to keep building the house with all the opposition that we get with our Tatnais out there. God, help us, and we'll praise you for all things. In Christ's name, amen. That's a challenging message, isn't it? God's laws do not alter. They're just like the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Whew. Huh?
How long did Haggai prophesy?
He prophesied for about 3 months.
3 months.
Huh? Well, 3 years is about, between 2 to 3 years is what Zechariah prophesied. But they both were called to stir Israel up and cause them to start rebuilding. But that second decree had nothing to do with the city. Neither did the third decree. Huh? Y'all are hearing something you won't hear in any church in America. Nobody will teach to this degree on the 70 weeks of Daniel. Nobody. They just don't teach on it. They don't understand it. You got to understand the history of Israel to understand it. Christopher, did you need something? Huh? You want some gum? Huh? Sure. All right, come here. What does Jonathan want? Does he want some juicy fruit? Huh?
What the?
Huh? Here.
Better know that.
Give him some. Take one to Jonathan. Okay? Whew.
I don't remember the answer to this. How many went into the captivity in 586?
Well, how many came back?
Went into captivity. How many were taken into captivity?
Well, some of the historians try to say not many. You have to understand the situation. Jeremiah said he would stay rather with the poor.
Right.
In the second deportation in the 25th chapter, 24th chapter, 2 Kings, the king of Babylon carried away all the artificers in metal so that they couldn't build any weapons. And he took all the technical guys, all the guys that ran computers, carried them all away so that they couldn't defend themselves when he came in 586.
Okay.
So there were a lot of people there, probably in the millions.
I would think that, yeah.
And he left a lot of people dead in the streets.
Okay.
They had to bury all those poor people. So we don't know how many were carried away, but we know when they got the decree to come back, most of them didn't come back, and there was less than 50,000 came back in the first decree.
And that was the picture I was trying to get in my mind of, just talking about the small, the few, the remnant today who are working to build the household of God compared to the...
Yeah, it's just a remnant who wants to build the house of God. It's not many.
No.
And building the house of God, Oracle Domeo, edify. I used to, when I'd run across the word edify, I said, let me get to a more important word. And I can take edify, Oracle Domeo, and teach on that for 6 months without even studying. Because we're the house of God, walk in the commandments of God, and all the imperative commands are a commandment of God.
Yeah.
And that's what builds up God's house. Which house are we?
And so the building of the household of God, that's a task that falls on men and women alike.
That's what?
That's a task
Well,
that
yes,
falls on
it's not
men
just
and women
men,
alike.
it's women too. You're the house of God.
Yeah.
I'm the house of God.
But it's just that women can't be preachers in
No.
a church.
No. But neither can all men.
Right.
All men are not called.
No.
It's amazing how people don't know anything about the 7 weeks of Daniel. They don't know nothing about it. I don't know a preacher that knows anything about it.
You said, I don't think anybody's preaching about this tonight, and I think you're probably right.
It's what?
You said, I don't think anybody's probably preaching about this tonight. And I think
No, I don't think anybody in America's preached on it. I don't think anybody this morning preached on it across America. You have to know the history of Israel to know this. You can't know it by just simply reading Daniel 9.